Good morning, Wabash. Today speaking at Pioneer Chapel is Dr. Shamira Gelbman. Shamira Gelbman is an associate professor of political science at Wabash, where she has taught courses on a wide range of topics, from public opinion polling to the civil rights movement, bodybuilding, and the politics of alcohol. Her research focuses on interest groups in American politics, and she is currently writing a book about the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, an organization that has coordinated lobbying in pursuit of civil rights legislation since the 1950s. If she had more free time, she'd spend it painting, weightlifting, and road tripping. Presenting her talk titled Tradition? Tradition, Dr. Shamira Gelbman.
Thanks, Brent, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak today. Good morning, Wabash. I think about tradition a lot. It's hard not to at Wabash. As one of the students I met during my interview 9 years ago put it, we're pretty into our traditions here. He said it somewhat sheepishly, since the context was an explanation of why it was probably a good thing that I was staying in Caleb Mill's house the week before Bell Week and not amidst the traditional loud shenanigans of Bell Week itself. But he also said it as a sort of proud affirmation that part of what makes Wabash Wabash is not merely the fact that there are campus traditions, but that these traditions are taken seriously by the community that performs them. Many Wabash traditions are enacted in specific locations. And so you think about the tradition when you enter or pass by those places, even when you're the only one around. For example, when you don't step on the seal at the entrance to Lilly Library in your pre-coffee early morning stupor, and are nevertheless stared down by Eli Lilly, well-polished and germ-laden by the hundreds of hands you know have been upholding the tradition of rubbing his head for good luck. I was alone when I walked over to the chapel today. While some are still living and working here on campus, the usual crowds of students and faculty heading from their 9:45 classes to wherever they go next were missing. There were no Rhines pacing the mall, urging everyone to go to chapel. But this building is the site of so many traditions. And so as I headed over from Baxter Hall, well, I first thought of how cold it was, but then I thought of crowds gathered to watch chapel sing, and exhausted freshmen being led into the chapel to prove their fight song fluency, and as the tradition has developed in recent years, to earn their W. I thought of hundreds of students rung inside the chapel in the decades since President Seymour introduced that tradition after the discovery of Caleb Mill's bell in the 1970s. And I thought of the chapel as the traditional backdrop for the commencement ceremony, where those same students are, by tradition, rung out with that same historic bell before they walk under the arch to sing a final round of Old Wabash on the steps of the Allen Center. I thought, and I guess I often think, about how these and other Wabash traditions shape this community, a community centered on a place with an ever-changing population as students cycle in through their 4-year stint on campus before going back out in the world to carry on as Wabash men elsewhere. In this revolving door community where people come and go, tradition facilitates the incorporation of newcomers and connects them to the hundreds who are already here. It fosters a sense of belonging and common purpose, and it provides familiarity and comfort in times of transition. The object of my field of study, American politics, also pushes me to think about tradition. The Constitution of the United States is a bare-bones framework for government, and a vast network of laws and traditions have emerged to flesh out its spare provisions in the 230 or so years since ratification. For example, the Constitution states that the Vice President of the United States is the President of the Senate, and it directs the Senate to choose a President pro tempore to preside when the Vice President is unavailable. By long-standing tradition, the Senate chooses the most senior member of its majority party to fill this role. That's the tradition. Similarly, the Constitution prescribes no presidential nomination process at all. But in recent decades, we've developed one that by tradition gives the unrepresentative state of Iowa and its quirky but traditional caucus procedure outsized influence in the selection of presidential candidates. There's some ambivalence about tradition in American politics. Democracy institutionalizes uncertainty. It demands a political process that leaves outcomes to be determined by the whims of an often unpredictable electorate, and it insists that we live with those outcomes for some undetermined duration. To the extent that we seek comfort in the face of uncertainty, the familiar rote of tradition offers some solace. But when things go wrong, and they seem to go wrong a lot lately, we question the advisability of those same traditions. We see this ambivalence in the speech Franklin Roosevelt gave when he broke tradition to address the Democratic National Convention upon his nomination for the presidency in 1932. He pronounced the practice of informing the nominee of his selection weeks after the convention to be an absurd tradition, and he committed his party to break foolish traditions in pursuit of progress, justice, and equality. Yet minutes later, he invoked tradition again as the basis for asserting his party as the bearer of progress and safety for a nation embroiled in economic depression. And so American politics makes me wonder about tradition. How do we distinguish between an absurd or foolish tradition and a tradition that's perhaps odd, but worth maintaining? Can we trust ourselves to recognize when our traditions have outlived their purpose, or worse, when they're actively causing harm? How bad do things need to get before we consider discarding long-held traditions? And how should we react when traditions are violated, whether by necessity or because someone decided to break them? Thinking about tradition is rooted in my upbringing in an Orthodox Jewish enclave in New York, where I spent the first half of my life. Tradition infuses everything where I grew up. We called it minhag, from the Hebrew root that also gives us the verb to drive, like you would drive a car, or I guess like you would drive a chariot back when the word was invented. Essentially, minhag, tradition, is the manner in which we navigate through the world. It's the communal and familial ways of being that replicate how our parents and their parents and their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents before them made their way through an often difficult and violently disrupted life. Where I grew up, minhag shapes everyday life, from which shoe you put on first, to the amount of time you wait between eating meat and dairy, and how you greet teachers and others who, by virtue of their age, wisdom, or profession, merit extraordinary respect. Minhag also shapes the way life's milestones are observed. So, for example, 3 weeks ago, my sister gave birth to twin boys. Traditionally, I'd say the Yiddish phrase, Kanai Nahara, when I tell you that, to ward off the evil eye. And by tradition, the twins were not named until they were formally brought into the fold when they turned 8 days old. 2 weeks ago, one of my high school teachers died of complications of COVID-19. By tradition, his burial took place within a day of his passing. And as hundreds of us watched on Zoom that day, his surviving wife, siblings, and children approximated funeral tradition as well as possible when they walked between two sparse lines of socially distanced spectators, not the usual crowded throngs who recited the traditional greeting to mourners, situating their fresh grief in the context of a people's ongoing history of loss and mourning. It's by coincidence that I'm here speaking about tradition today, the last day of Passover, a week-long holiday teeming with traditions meant to commemorate the biblical story of Jews released from slavery in ancient Egypt. The highlight of Passover, or Pesach as we called it, is the Seder, a 14-step ritual dinner that kicks off the holiday. The Seder's first 4 steps are a quick preamble. So you drink a glass of wine, it's red wine by tradition. You wash your hands. You eat a small vegetable appetizer, basically an olive-sized piece of boiled potato dipped in salt water in the tradition of my Eastern European ancestors, and you break a large matzah, a traditional flatbread, in half. And then you settle in for the 5th step, the dreaded Maajid. Maajid means a narrator or a preacher, and this 5th step of the Seder is a rambling recounting of the Exodus from slavery, of Talmudic commentaries on Exodus-related biblical passages, and of ancient rabbinic praise for those who tell the story of the Exodus at great length. Where I grew up, Maajid is recited in ancient Hebrew and a bit of Aramaic, and Maajid can go on forever. It starts well enough with a traditional proclamation inviting the poor and hungry to join the Seder, as though dinner is going to be served anytime soon. And then the youngest person present, usually a child, poses 4 traditional questions, all essentially asking why the Seder features so many weird traditions. And then begins the actual Maajid, the endless, disjointed narration interspersed periodically with unspoken instructions, unspoken because we all know what to do, because it's tradition, to stand and raise a second glass of red wine that won't be drunk until Maajid is over, or to point to traditional food items, the broken matzah, freshly grated horseradish to remind us of the bitter hardship of slavery, or a roasted lamb shank that per tradition won't actually be consumed. Maajid is a slog, and so families create their own traditions to make it a bit less painful. Some have Seder participants take turns reading different passages. Others do some of the reading in English. Some reenact parts of the Exodus story in an extended game of charades. Others bust out novelty frogs and other props at key junctures in the narration. We did none of that. My grandfather was a classically trained chazan, a cantor or a liturgical singer, and Maajid Bias was a performance. It was a stately performance, crafted to evoke the emotional highs and lows, the grief and triumph of the Exodus story, and to elevate arcane passages you'd otherwise just as well skip. And it was a traditional performance with distinctive melodies and melismas that were exactly the same year after year. It was a performance entirely in Old Hebrew and a bit of Aramaic, with the exception of 4 words. As my grandfather launched into Maajid, he'd sing in English, and the answer is, a phrase that mystified me despite its familiarity. It wasn't melodically necessary, and it was certainly not part of the traditional text from which there was otherwise no deviation. A simple explanation is that my grandfather was directing this phrase, and the answer is, to whichever of his children or nieces or nephews or grandchildren had recited the 4 questions at that year's Seder. That is, he was reminding them that the convoluted Maajid offers the traditional answer to their questions. Maybe not the straightforward answer the poor kid was hoping for, but an answer nonetheless. But I like to think that it was actually self-directed, that with this tradition of interjecting a non-traditional phrase into an ancient traditional text, my grandfather was reminding himself of the purpose of his performance, that he was performing not to show off his vocal talent or to get a house full of impatient, hungry people through Maajid, or even because that's what tradition dictated he do. Rather, his performance would be the latest, though not the last, link in a centuries-old chain of fathers and grandfathers instructing and instilling in their children the values of inquiry and historical memory. And so for me, the lesson of "and the answer is" is a call to protect tradition from becoming a mindless rut of going through the motions because that's just what we do, because it's tradition. It's a lesson to step back, if only for a few seconds, to think about how our traditions came to be and why we continue to enact them. These days, it feels like every tradition is under attack, already disrupted or about to be disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic and the social distancing and stay-at-home orders that have transformed everyday life. This hits hard in mid-April here at Wabash, where we normally kick off a month of tradition after tradition, culminating in commencement, the traditional send-off for graduating seniors, before the quiet summer months of preparation for ringing in a new class. We've had no emails warning us to move our cars for bed races this year. We've canceled so many festivities that traditionally mark the winding down of the spring semester. And we're wondering what a virtual awards chapel and commencement in the coming weeks will look like. But if there are silver linings to this disruption, and I like to hope that there are, perhaps one is its impetus to reflect on our traditions, to abstract meaning from the motions we normally go through as we consider how to rework them in virtual form, or sometimes as we decide to cancel them, and to anticipate how meaningful they'll be when we're back to perform them together in person next year. I'm looking forward to it. Be well, everyone, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Shamira. One quick announcement. Please continue to go online to the Wabash College calendar at www.wabash.edu/calendar for the latest updates regarding online events and activities, such as the annual awards chapel on April 23rd and the virtual commencement ceremony scheduled for May 17th. A link is also available on the page to subscribe to a daily email with the full schedule and links to each event for that day. Now, wherever you may be watching, please rise and join in the singing of Old Wabash.